course, you are familiar with the star, director, producer of the film, Mr. Kenneth Branagh. I'm Andy Wallenstein. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of Variety, and thanks for coming out to the screening. Let's have a little Q&A, shall we?
Yes.
So you, of course, are no stranger to the works of Shakespeare, many times over, of course, throughout your career. When it came to doing the life of Shakespeare, though, I was curious, what drew you to those final 3 years? Because you could have approached this material in a number of ways.
Well, it sort of became clear over the years of working on his plays and finding out a little bit about him that this initial traumatic event, the burning down of that theatre, was had a profound impact. He'd been there 20 years, and he was a sharer, he was a producer, he was a writer, he was an actor. And it struck me as interesting that he would decide, well, that's it, and he would go back to his hometown, a town in which he'd sort of left in semi-disgrace, and certainly his father had this, he was the mayor of Stratford, and then was accused of usury, and there was a great falling there was a great disgrace. So to go back to that town, someone who was now very glamorous and celebrity, really, was the greatest, acknowledged to be the greatest writer of his age, to go back and sort of face up to whatever was the results of having been an absentee father, an absentee husband, and to do so while needing to acquire these things. You know, he did spend £20 or about $5,000 on that coat of arms that allowed him to be called gentleman, and it seemed, curious that should, just as Ian McKellen's character says in this, why does it bother you? Why does it matter? And so I guess I wanted also to do what Shakespeare does so many times in historical plays. He takes the facts of a life. So in this case, he did go back to Stratford. The two girls were both involved in sexual scandals. He did leave his wife the second best bed. All of those facts are there, but in between, we were trying to find the man, basically, and we tried to find the man through the plays, just like he would. He didn't know anything about what went on behind closed doors in Julius Caesar's house, but he did know what the dates of his life were, and he filled in the rest of it. So we had all this material about in the plays. He writes about twins so often, he writes about the loss of children so often, and particularly at the end of his life, he wrote plays about the problems with daughters, and the loss of daughters, and the desire to reunite a family. So all of that seemed to be wrapped up in those last 3 years somehow.
I was curious, as you talk about all these facts from his life, obviously this is something that is fact-based and somewhat of a fictional elaboration, but how important was it to be authentic, given most viewers probably wouldn't know the difference, to some of the facts that you do render very faithfully?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, again, starting with this sort of Shakespearean approach, in spirit, we were trying to find the humanity in the man, and so in order to take that license, it felt as though for some people, for instance, it's just they don't want Shakespeare to be interested in having a mortgage. They don't want their geniuses thinking like this. There's a sort of post 1800, post the Romantics. Geniuses became people with classical educations who looked like Lord Byron and who were mad, bad, and dangerous to know. They were not men having trouble with their daughters and their wives giving them a legitimate hard time for their behaviour, and wanting to spend £20 on being called a gentleman and being proud of having the second house in Stratford. This is more along the lines of what Flaubert referred to when he said, be bourgeois in your private life and revolutionary in your artistic life. But for some people, that's not how they want their geniuses. They want their geniuses to be colourful and to sort of be more sort of rock and roll. And so that seemed to me one of the beautiful paradoxes of what one felt about the facts of Shakespeare's life. And so much of it seemed to me there are so many parts of the story that feel so universal, but they get set off so we know that he extravagantly dedicated the sonnets and Venus and Adonis, his narrative poem, to the Earl of Southampton. And it's a legitimate speculation, I think, to suggest that the feeling in those poems, which are little plays in themselves, could legitimately lead you to believe that there was a real passionate and genuine and sincere feeling for the object of those poems, in the poems, enough to warrant the idea that a woman who cannot read and write in Stratford, who has heard that this, for non-publication, this privately circulated pamphlet is now for public consumption, and just like we might nowadays, and with most writing, go, well, it's really autobiographical, isn't it? It's really, he's writing about what he knows, isn't it? So we know that he knew the Earl of Southampton, we knew about those dedications. We don't know that Anne gave him that kind of grief, but we do know that he came back to Anne and they were together, and that it seemed to me, Ian, for instance, Ian McKellen talks in a one-man show he used to do. He asks the audience if they know Shakespeare. He said, "Can you recommend any marriage in these plays? Is there any successful marriage?" He says, because there isn't. The only successful marriage is the Macbeths, and they kill people. But in fact, I think there are quite a lot of relationships that he definitely presents in feisty form. The Percys in the Henry IV plays, Benedict and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing is at least a very sparky sort of union. So I think it's not hard to start saying, well, where did that come from? Let's assume maybe that came from life as well, in which case, and it's William Shakespeare. He married someone who was 9 years older than him, and it's an obvious thing to say Anne Hathaway must have had something. One can maybe assume she may not have been able to read and write, but I think it's a legitimate assumption to suggest that she ain't stupid, and so somewhere between the facts of the known facts, he married her, he came back maybe once a year, we know that, so he wasn't away the whole time, but so that combination of sort of allowing the facts to try and set off what would be situations that we understand, like this peculiar left turn in the movie where this man wrapped in a fairly relatable, as it were, heterosexual situation, an ordinarily difficult family situation. Stuff in families goes on, it's difficult in this particular way for him. And there he is, I guess, in some ways, working out, well, what do I do with the evening of my life? I've had the morning and the afternoon pretty packed, doing my 20 years of, creating masterpieces or just being busy at a theatre. What do I do with it? I've got to be creative. I'll start a garden. That sounds good. Shakespeare, and we know that, so we don't know that Shakespeare did this, but we know that he mentions flowers, plants 800 times in his plays. He quotes 140 different species of flora and fauna in these plays. So he knew what he was talking about.
Presume he had a green
Well, I think maybe he didn't do it as well as he knew about it, but he was a country guy. But in there, it's so fascinating to me to think that, as I know people who get to that point and are thinking a kind of what's it all about? What does it add up to? In his case, he's got this amazing thing. Christ, I did all of that, all of these plays, but I also, this is my family and this is what they think of me and what matters to me more, because I'd like my wife to love me. I'd like her to respect me. I'd like my daughters to respect me, but maybe, and is this, but I wrote Hamlet. So maybe that's okay. But into this comes a man who's at work, a love affair that could take you away from all of this, and suddenly it's clearly a feeling for another man, which is brutally knocked back by saying I love you, but not in that way, and also I'm never going to love you because you're a peasant. And hanging a 20 quid shield above your door's never going to do it. So those kinds of, those human, the human filling between those facts. I mean, he really did stand up in that church and call her a whore. He said she had gonorrhea publicly. Everybody knew about it. 7,000 people in that town. You know what small towns are like. Everybody's talking about everything. Everybody knows everything. Beautiful to be in a lovely community, but sometimes challenging. And Quiney, Tom Quiney, when he was discovered that he had made Margaret Wheeler pregnant, and she had died tragically in childbirth, 6 weeks after he married Judith Shakespeare, he was punished. He was brought to court, and he was He was made to parade in front of the population of the church on 3 successive Sundays, dressed in his undershirt.
Interesting fact.
Yeah.
And you brought this devotion authenticity all the way to your very appearance in this movie. I mean, the makeup is remarkable. You are totally transformed, but it also begs the question, why bother transforming for someone who there are paintings of and isn't exactly known iconically, like, oh, you've got to get this right. So why did you need to get it right?
Well, again, it's an interesting question. It's really the one I asked myself early on. So how did I try and answer that? I went to the National Portrait Gallery in London. There's a picture there called NPG1. It was the very first acquisition of the National Portrait Gallery in about 1847, and it was indeed a portrait of Shakespeare. It's called the Chandos portrait because it was owned by Lord Chandos, who donated it to the fledgling national institution. It was painted by a painter called John Taylor in about 1608, and although people dispute this, because everybody disputes everything about Shakespeare, the weight of evidence suggests that this is the one portrait that he might have sat for. So the image that you saw right at the beginning of the film, briefly, was the painting that most scholars would agree was most likely to be Shakespeare and that he would have sat for it. So I went to the National Portrait Gallery to see NPG1, and I stood in front of it to ask myself, well, maybe it should just be me in a beard. People, as you say, don't wake up knowing what Shakespeare looked like, as it were. So maybe that would be more truthful in some way. We're not, it's a film, but it has a Mona Lisa kind of stare. So he looks directly ahead, and you really feel he's looking at you, and you're having a conversation. No reproduction, as I'm sure you know, of any great painting really does it justice, and neither does this or any other reproduction. The eyes were so soulful, the eyes were so warm and so wry and so compassionate. I don't know whether I was projecting all of this, but that's how I felt they were. And it seemed to me that's who I needed to be. I needed to get inside that man's spirit, into those eyes. And paradoxically, I thought, so what I should do, I should try and look like this. I should look like him, because if this is the one we think is him, and those eyes and that soul, that window of the soul that we're seeing through the eyes is really what we're trying to get. That's what I'm after in this film. I should try and look like him. I should, but not put, I've got sort of light blue, grey eyes, and he has, if this painting is accurate, had sort of hazel eyes. But I thought, well, I won't use contact lenses because they will mask that life that I'm seeing bizarrely in front of this painting. But I'll try and do everything else. It felt like the right thing to do. Get me out of the way, but try and get in through the eyes to this fellow, to the inside of this fellow, who for me was very, very, very present in this portrait. Very moving portrait to look at. I went many times to see it. That's where I started. So we then just began the long process of developing with Vanessa White and Neil Gorton, the designers of the makeup, to first work out how to do it and what it should look like, how we fix it and how we disguise it and how we wear it, and then how do we do it quickly, please, because I need to be on set directing. So they turned into absolute whiz kids in the end. Once we'd done all the tests ahead of time, months ahead, they then did it in 2 hours each morning. And it was pretty good, I must say, very impressive. It was a low budget, tight shoot and everything, so that's what needed to happen.
So from the very beginning, were you thinking about playing Shakespeare? Because as you mentioned, you're director here as well. Was there ever a time where you were thinking about doing one or the other?
It was for me, the film is it's like another bit of my life. When I was 16 years old, I hitchhiked to Stratford-on-Avon. First time I'd ever hitchhiked anywhere, I was terrified. And I took my tent and I camped in a little campsite about a mile outside Stratford. And each day I walked into Stratford and I queued up for a return ticket for the play that was on in the theatre that night. And during the day I went to the Shakespeare places. So I went to New Place and I went to the Birthplace and I went to Anne Hathaway's cottage. And I really, at 16, I was already starting the conversation of going, gosh, how do these small rooms that he really did live, these tables he touched, these gloves his father made, all this reality, all this evidence of a real life lived there, how does it connect to these great big plays up there in places he'd maybe never been to, in Sicily or Vienna or Venice or whatever, or in ancient Rome? How do those two things join up? So, and for me, that's been the next 40 years have been spent sort of exploring it. And in a way, it's a kind of, it's a sort of, I mean, the man's given me a career, you know, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, Andy, frankly, if, you know, so it's a kind of act of, it's a sort of act of, he may not think so in the great, wherever he's sitting, but it's a kind of act of gratitude as well, that just you know, what I come from a working class family. My family didn't go to the theatre, we didn't know anything about Shakespeare, and so it was always important to me to somehow, or at least I felt it was important to do these plays when they first started to make sense to me. They felt real. They just felt real. It felt like it made sense, whatever it was. An early production of Romeo and Juliet, very passionate, full of, you know, adolescent sex, which preoccupied me at that time, and fights, and you know, all this stuff. It felt like a reflection of our playground, you know. And when it started to make that kind of sense, I was so keen to sort of share it with my parents and not have them feel there was some big barrier between this and so-called great art. And one way of understanding is if you can feel that you understand the man or where it's come from, or a version of the man. This is all this is. So for me, that started then and has gone through the rest of my life, saying, somehow trying to be part of the process that continually tries to offer up this man's work to the world, which can sometimes associate him with somehow heavy, intellectual, dry, dreary, dull, boring, have to study it, doesn't mean anything to me, and I get all of that, but I when it works, I think differently, and this is maybe one way of heading people back into that work.
So when you inhabited the character, you depicted it, does it change your understanding of his work? Do you bring something extra? Because I'm sure you've got more Shakespeare in you, and whether it's on the stage or the screen, and I just wonder if this experience kind of brings something new to that.
Well, one of the more recent prompts to making the film was being in a production of The Winter's Tale, Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, in the theatre 2 or 3 years ago, with Judi Dench playing an incredibly passionate, strong woman called Paulina in the play, and she, as it were, speaks truth to power. Leontes, which I played, was the stupid, jealous, vainglorious man whose vanity causes eventually the death of his own child, who sort of dies of a broken heart. That's what The Winter's Tale seems to suggest, and that spectre of the child that will forever haunt him was one of the things that led us to this. Judy's portrayal of Paulina was one of the things that led us to her portrayal of Anne Hathaway, and what I think I felt in playing Leontes in The Winter's Tale, and in the mood of that play, in the ache of that play, across the 4 late plays of Shakespeare, it feels as though you see a man almost leaping out of the pages to say, bring my family back together, please bring this kid back. And he can't, and it's tragic and it's bittersweet. And as I was playing it, to answer your question, I carried that with me, and I felt this, and tried to convey this sense of what I see in the plays, which is this tremendous aching loss, at the same time as a certainty that life must go on. And the end lyric of the song at the end, the verses that Judy reads with the girls, is from one of the late plays, Cymbeline, which is a sort of this wonderful Shakespearean wry understanding of a way to face death, which is one way to come to terms with loss, you know. And she says, fear no more the heat of the sun. So you're never going to get sunburn anymore, nor the furious winter's rages. You never get cold. You'll never be in a snowstorm anymore. Thou thy worldly task hast done. It's all over. Home art gone. So you're going to somewhere familiar. And ta'en thy wages. And you got paid for it as well, in whatever way that means, money or experience or whatever. Golden lads, like Hamlet. Golden lads and girls we all have to, like chimney sweepers, come to dust. And it's such a daft line, it's like, because of course if you are a chimney sweeper, you will indeed hit dust, that's your job, and we will return to dust, because that's the nature of the human cycle. That kind of, even in that lyric, I think, is that sort of Shakespearean kind of it's like a sort of it's like a tickle, but it has sadness in it as well. And that bittersweet quality, that engagement with life, knowing that we've always got to deal with the yin and the yang of human experience. You know, we'll lose people, but you know, and the sun will rise again. One day we'll stop crying. We'll maybe be able to, you know, smile and think about that person fondly. And I felt when I was looking at his portrait. I felt that weight of his experience, and I felt that it came from the place, and I wanted to try and, you know, bring that into here. And as I was playing it, it felt like it came back and sort of channeled through me.
As an accomplished dramatist of Shakespeare's works, I'm just curious, do you worry about Shakespeare's place in culture in the future? Obviously, he's held up quite well over the years. Maybe there's nothing to worry about. I mean, that's why I'm just curious. Do you look at it as something as you're a steward of him and you gotta, you know, handle it carefully so he goes on, or it's like, you know what, this guy's got it. He'll be around.
Well, I think both things are at play. I think that I think Shakespeare's dead when he is revered to the point of sort of deification, and you know, he deals in this human matter. So he's not Mozart, he's not Beethoven. He doesn't have music, which he has words and he has story and he has characters. But I think he has to work harder to stay relevant, is maybe one way to put it, but just stay meaningful. And I think one of the glories of Shakespeare across the world, across cultures, across ages, across mediums, is that it keeps being rediscovered, reinvented. I think that that's a healthy thing. And I think that even people, they reinvent it because they hate it, or they think he's this kind of person or that kind of person, his politics are this or they're that, and all the place, just like the internet, you can prove anything or disprove anything on the internet, and you can do it in Shakespeare as well, that he's one kind of person rather than another. He seems to be sort of everything, but that everything gets shaken by so many people so repeatedly that he ends up having to earn his right to be respected. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes his art very alive. But I do revere this work. But I love the roughness in it. I love the flaws, you know. And I tried to find a way to keep flaws in the film. We had a moment where at the end of the film, they ask Shakespeare, just when he's quite ill, what would he like to do today? It's his birthday, and he quotes a bit from Midsummer Night's Dream. He goes, "I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite over-canopied with luscious woodbine." The word is over-canopied. When we came to do the scene, I said or-canopied, which is sometimes what Shakespeare does. He'll put an apostrophe in there instead of over, he'll say or, and I said or-canopied. As I said this, the great know-it-all, Judi Dench, to my right, lit up because she was so thrilled that I got it wrong. Because she knows the place backwards. But anyway, she's so thrilled. But I'd said to them before we started, I said, you know, we're gonna, like the Italians in architecture who always say, it's good to have a piece of imperfection in there. Don't make it too perfect. We're gonna do that with the film. So clearly I'd messed up. And she enjoyed that enormously. But we got to the end of it, and we were still shooting, and I hadn't cut or anything. And so I said at the end of the piece that I was quoting, it says, there sits Titania, sometimes of the night, lulled in these flowers with dances and delight. And she looked at me, still thrilled that she knew I'd messed it up. And then I said to her, which was improvised, "You probably know the rest of this, don't you?" And she immediately she lit up further because she knew she could sort of show up. She said, "And there the snake sheds his enamelled skin, weed wide enough to wrap a fairy in," and which made me laugh and her laugh and the girls laugh. And that's in the movie. We wasn't expecting it to happen. We were constantly trying to find that bit of life and fun and rawness inside it, and imperfection with love. You know, these people are flawed human beings, but in so being, don't you reckon that as it were, the more flawed Shakespeare is, the more he is his own raw material to transform into these portrayals of other folk in his plays?
One last question, and at the risk of sounding silly, I'm going to ask it. what do you think Shakespeare would have thought looking at this? Would he have been someone who would have reacted sensitively or appreciated the drama of it all? Did you even think about that kind of thing?
It's a good question. I wonder whether maybe both, you know, because if he'd said sort of, how dare you, you might have said, well, here's a few people who are queuing up to say the same thing to you, Shakespeare. But I would have thought, I could look him in the eye and say, sir, this was done with love. It was done with love. I'm sorry if we got any of it wrong, but I kiss the hem of your garment.
Have a